Thanks, Ian. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Ian's just explained the double nature of this talk, which has partly been brought on us by the events in Syria since December, in which with the overthrow of the Assad regime and a new government installing itself with a promise to make itself a government for all communities. We'll go into that in the second half. As Ian says, there'll be two halves, but I'll just we'll start with the book. This is part of the I think it's the back cover of the book, which explains what it tries to do, which is to look at the history of Syria through 40 monuments. I always think 40 monuments or monuments tell an interesting story which relate not just to aesthetic interests but also to how they were put together and what that shows about the structure of the society. But what I tried to do in the book is to pick out the trends amid the kaleidoscope of events across these centuries, 30 or more, and that's what the book tries to do, to plot for the reader. So I hope it's an easy way to get through the history of the country. So, as Ian said, I've divided the talk into two halves, and there'll be a session for questions which relate to the history, and then we plunge into the present with a discussion about Syria since December 1924. So I'll just take 3 of the 40 monuments today. You don't have to sit through all 40 of them. Because what I want to show is how complicated is the process by which they were put together. The 3 monuments are the Temple of Bel in Palmyra, the Byzantine church at Kalbloze, which is in the Orontes Valley, and finally a once little known house of a Jewish banker in Damascus, Beit Fahram. Now the Temple of Bel is not a Roman monument. Those of you who've had ambitions of finding their superb example of Roman architecture will find many things which will offend the Roman sensitivities. But what did it convey to the inhabitants of the desert oasis? And is this experience any different for us? Palmyra sits on the trade route between the Levant coast and Mesopotamia, and tended to follow the valley system. The original links between these two places followed the red line, which, as you can see, follows the Euphrates River and then diverted towards the coast. But the importance of Palmyra from the Roman period was the fact that the development of the cross-desert route, which cut many days off the journey, because of the exploitation of a source of water, which made it possible to get from the Mesopotamian to the Mediterranean side with much less difficulty. So the Romans took on board the program of spreading their interest in the economy of Syria by developing this trade route because of the rich flow of imports which could be tapped from Persia into Rome and vice versa. But they didn't actually control Palmyra until about another century in AD 75. What ideas prevailed when the inhabitants set out to vastly expand their traditional cult centre in Palmyra? A lot of modern commentators note that the plan for the Artemis Temple, the plan for the Bel Temple in Palmyra follows the Artemis Temple at Magnesia on the Meander, which is well to the west on on the Mediterranean coast of Turkey. I was always curious about this comparison, so I actually had a chance to go and see Magnesia on the Meander a few months ago, and was a bit shocked to discover the story that the temple at Magnesia on the Meander had disappeared is not true, because it was there, and the Turks are very busily reconstructing it, because it didn't just get knocked down and and survive only as a pile of ruins. It was there under the mud. So they've been clearing all the mud away, and we have a much better idea now of what the Temple of Meander looks like, and it's nothing like the Temple of Berlin, Palmyra. But nevertheless, the two can be compared from the point of view of a very large temple building which stood in a huge courtyard surrounded by colonnades. In both cases, the entire courtyard had to be re-leveled to emphasize the grandeur of the temple at the center. And in Palmyra, nothing was spared to make it monumental, just as it was seen as a symbol. But was it just seen as a symbol of imposed domination? Let's test that by looking more closely at the structure. The Romans, particularly the famous architectural commentator Vitruvius, might have been shocked at the liberties taken with the architectural template in Palmyra. In Palmyra, there was only one large chamber with two shrines facing each other across a longitudinal space. There were windows galore. There were towers poking out of the roof of the temple at each corner, and there was a long, slow rise up to the western doorway, which was obviously the main, in fact, only doorway to the temple. And all other Greek and Roman temples always had to be approached from one end or the other, not from the long side. The decoration in detail was even more a pastiche of styles, and lo and behold, there were many Mesopotamian touches. The north shrine in the central temple was dedicated to a Mesopotamian triad. On the opposite south side, the image of Bel was honoured. So what we're looking at here in the photo is towards the north, with the Bel temple, with the Bel shrine, flanked by these huge two-dimensional altars which honoured the whole arrangement. Nothing like this is seen in Roman or Greek temples. The reason for some of the reason for the changes was that in the Semitic tradition, sacrifices were usually conducted from the corner towers on the roof, because in the tradition of the high places, the shrine had to have a direct line of contact with the heavens. So the central shrine in Palmyra, with its four corner towers, was completed in the 70s AD. But the project was enormous in scope, because the courtyard was many times as you can see on the plan to the left, the courtyard was numerous times bigger than the actual shrine in the middle. So by the time the final project was being completed, the imperial style very much prevailed in the tradition of the Roman metropolis. But even here, sometimes practical considerations prevailed. The reason why the entrance was on one side was because there were two shrines, one at one end and one at the other at the other. So every effort was made to highlight the eccentric positioning of the principal doorway. It actually interrupted the column portico on the western side, unlike anything in the classical canon. Also, Ptolemaic influence could be detected in the slightly trapezoidal shape of the door, which is very common in Egypt at the time. So it presented the visitor with a spectacularly Baroque device wedged into the classical colonnade. And I put next to the example here from Palmyra a double doorway in the same style which comes from Komombo in Upper Egypt. But sponsorship was everything as the massive project reached completion, as the Eastern trade boomed by the 2nd century. Those who profited from the trade were lent on to fund this gesture, especially the wealthy traders tapping the caravan contacts with Persia. And nothing could be more characteristically Semitic than this scene of a camel bearing a palanquin, followed by a group of veiled women. This relief relates to the Semitic tradition of carrying a god's image in procession, in this case within a camel-borne tent, or kuba, passed on in the Muslim tradition of the Meccan Kaaba. But before we leave the Temple of Bel, I just have to draw your attention to one stone, which tragically met its fate in 2015. In the southern shrine to Bel, the Mesopotamian god, the ceiling of the shrine was one solid piece of limestone which had been carved in intricate detail, as you can see in the lower left photo. One reason why Western 18th century visitors began to flock to Palmyra in the end was to seek new examples of classical style, as they were searching for fresh material for their pattern books during the revival of classical architecture in Europe at the time. This stone had survived 2,000 years in which the main hostile forces it had to contend with were earthquakes. Unfortunately, in 2015, Islamic State had a different take on why monuments were useful. The Bel Temple was blown apart by explosive experts of Islamic State. This picture was taken from the spot where the monolith ceiling was formerly positioned. Very effective work to dispatch 2,000 years of the building's history in a few seconds. But one feature had survived: the Great Western Doorway. Fortunately, it had been rebuilt in the 1930s around a ferro-concrete core which had helped stabilise the structure. Amid the dust and the rubble, a few stubs of column drums marked by the yellow arrows survived, and the great doorway still stood proud as marked by the green arrow. Unfortunately, of the great monolith ceiling, nothing was left. Okay, we're taking a separate example now. Oh, sorry, I've got some more comments on that. I just want to raise one question. Does executing monuments make sense? Some archaeologists have argued that we should leave ruined fields untouched as, if you like, monuments to monuments. Maybe monuments just mean different things to different people. Many interpret them as representing a colonialist mentality of interest only to wealthy tourists, from Europe in particular. But the death in 2015 of Khalid al-Assad, who you can see there crouching down against one of the tombs from Palmyra, he had been director for about 30 years of excavations at the site, and who played a formidable role in giving us a new picture of Palmyra than the traditional one of the Roman desert city. Indeed, he was prepared to face beheading at the hands of ISIS, who wanted to demonstrate that history's year zero began with the arrival of Islam. Sure, in rescuing the country, the physical fabric to support the Syrian society is more important But the monuments of Syria are part of the equation. And many Syrians also see them as part of a complex identity. Let's move now to the second example of the pitfalls of identifying buildings to provide ammunition in culture wars. As we saw in Palmyra, Syria can't be explained by one thesis, and only in modern times have we adopted the idea that architectural thoughts are, if you like, transactional commodities. Here I want to draw attention to the significance of these transverse arches, which still today support all the wall structure and the roof footings of the temple of the church at Kalblose in the Syrian, what are often called dead cities. To me, these are a breakthrough idea of the building, which make it a remarkable example into modern times. But they were also common in 6th century Syria. Unfortunately, some people like to make other things of architectural features. And a book called Stealing from the Saracens. Does anyone here know the book? Okay. Sees the west front of the church, which is still largely intact, as the breakthrough idea, and seek to make us feel guilty for not identifying that this was a Saracenic idea, which 500 years later turned up in Gothic architecture, notably Notre Dame. Now, it's easy to start crazes in archaeology, don't start me on that. The industry feeds on argument. In this case, we have stolen the ideas without crediting the Arabs, i.e. the Saracens. I.e., in fact, the church plan had nothing to do with Saracens. The carved figure of a stylite, one of those column saints who spread their centres all over Byzantine Syria. The carved figure of a stylite saint has been mischievously inserted on the narrow panel separating two of the windows of the western front. And they give us a much firmer clue to the building's real provenance. It was the work of a team of Byzantine craftsmen, funded from Constantinople by the Emperor Zeno, engaged to build the nearby church of the Byzantine stylite St. Simeon. That too still stands. The building then was neither Arab nor Muslim, but Byzantine, and 200 years before Islam arrived in Syria. Let's go back to the real architectural significance of the church, namely its sweeping arches. They were all, as I said, they were all the rage in 6th century Syria. And there was a very good example in Baalbek, which you won't see these days, because the French took it down to expose the remains of the great temple of Jupiter. But it's also noting that in terms of the exchange of ideas, the bold treatment at the back end of the church, seen on the top left, could crop up later in Crusader Beirut. I prefer to see such borrowing as quite normal and a tribute, not larceny. The theme of the new work I'm involved in, which is a project which I started about 10 years ago, or in conjunction with an Australian archaeologist in Oxford, is to prove that the strength of architectural traditions is often the borrowing of ideas from one building to another. Our third and last case is the newly restored knockout experience in Damascus, which has been, unfortunately, not visitable since the conflict began. But the intention was to open it to the public for some purpose, possibly as a hotel for tourists, of course. The refurbishment was done by a Syrian Syrian team and finished just as the conflict broke out. You can see the restoration is absolutely superb. It's a knockout when you walk in. It's quite extraordinary. but it's a Jewish house in largely largely Muslim city. The person who financed it was a banker who was the treasurer, if you like, to the Turkish governor in Acre in Palestine. He was a very faithful employee of the Ottoman Empire and was well known even to the authorities in Istanbul. For example, he had lost his ear when he was imprisoned to the jealous intervention of a henchman of the local governor, Jazar Pasha, who was a notoriously violent figure. And he was still wearing an eye patch, as you can see in the photo, in the sketch on the top right in the slide. 20 years later, he was assassinated by order of the fourth Ottoman governor, Abdullah Pasha, in his modest apartment in the Franks Khan in Acre, as you can see on the bottom right. But Haim's magnificent family home back in Damascus is still with us, and is a merger of cultures with a small collection of inscriptions in Hebrew, adding a low-key tribute to its original owner's faith. Haim's family house is his monument. It achieved fame in Frederick Leighton's painting, as you can see on the left of this slide. It's in a collection in London, which I've never actually been to, but I think the painting is entitled "Gathering Lemons," and is quite fabulous colour, which you can see is still repeated in the modern reconstruction of the building. So this is our third and last extract from the book, which is intended to stop us feeling guilty about enjoying ideas passing from one culture to another. And I'll leave it there for some questions.
Please wait for the intern under the microphone to reach you.
Hi, I was interested to hear about your position with regard to Semitic. There's been a lot of talk about anti-Semitic lately, and it's been a big topic for two of the local organisations that support Zionism. And so I find it a very pointed subject, but I'd be interested to hear the original version or the traditional version of what Semitism actually is, from your position and what you've researched.
Well, that's a bit more for the second half of the talk, but I think the cultures which spread all over the Middle East by the first millennium BC were all largely Semitic, except for the ones which were Aramaic. But the Semitic tradition then flowed into a whole range of other areas, including Saudi Arabia, Palestine, etc. And it just meant that you were speaking a Semitic language. So it was a very broad brush. To use it these days in a very specialised sense, I think, is unfortunate.
We've probably got time for one. Let's make it two more questions. And then we probably don't need this. Do you want the slides still? Or should we?
I was getting some people prepared this also for the next one.
John.
I wasn't going to ask a question in the first half, but Palmyra would surely have been on the Silk Road, which gives it access not simply to Persia, but also to India and ultimately to China, to whom the Roman Empire was basically losing money because the Chinese had things that the Romans wanted and Rome didn't have anything the Chinese wanted. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, you're starting to get into Mr. Dalrymple's territory there. And he had an absolute blast against an exhibition currently at the British Museum in London, which talked about the Silk Road, ignoring the fact that it had included India. And I'm totally with Dalrymple on that. I think it's ridiculous to forget that Indian goods, or goods from even further on, from further east than India, did flow into the Tigris and Euphrates system, then across through Palmyra. But there were other ways for that to travel, and I think a lot of that trade from India probably flowed up through the Red Sea and up into Egypt and then on to... they were competing routes.
Last question. All right, second.
Hello, you mentioned Khalid al-Assad, and he's a person I've got tremendous respect for. He named his daughter Zenobia after the ancient queen. He also studied Aramaic during his conservation work in Palmyra, and so I believe you also previously met him. So I was wondering, what do you believe his impact is on the studies of Palmyra as a city?
Oh, huge. I mean, he's totally fashioned the interpretation of Palmyra. But the line he was exploring was very much backed up by all the work done by numerous other expeditions, including German, French, Italian, Poland, etc. So it's just overturned the whole picture of what we understand by Rome and Palmyra, and I think he was the inspiration behind much of it. But the picture was developing in people's minds anyway, but I think he did it in a way he presented the site with the signs, etc., educational programs. That was very much the message that he got across. It was absolute tragedy that he was just beheaded.
One last question.
Hello.
Just one.
Thank you. I remember reading in 2015 about the beheading of the curator, and at the time it had said that he had hidden a lot of archaeological items which he refused to give up to IS, and hence the reason for the beheading. I don't know if you've got anything further to add on that. I felt it was such an act of bravery. I mean, it was an incredible thing to have happened.
Well, I think in fact he would have. There had been a lot of stuff hidden, which was actually taken secretly before the IS arrived, because they were active further east in the region for some weeks or months, and in that time they were quietly removing truckloads of stuff to the basement of the Damascus Museum. So that's probably what they had heard about, but of course he couldn't get them. He couldn't give them back from the Damascus Museum, so but he certainly he would never have given them up, even if they'd been in his back room. You know, he was an extraordinary person.
Ross, congratulations on your fascinating book and the many beautiful photos, quite a large number of which are your own. Very, very stunning book. I recommend it to everyone. Available through the Cambridge University Press.
No. It's available here through Abby's bookshop. I've also got here a series of flyers, which I hate to be undermining the market for Abby's, but if you use one of those QR codes on the flyers, you can get it at a price reduced by the publishers, and they will post it out to you. I think post free if you pay them directly. So they're over there.
Much recommended. Okay, time to move with heavy hearts on political changes in Syria next December. I might have this slide off.
So this is the next slide. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Next slide. It says interlude. We just had the interlude. So what I've listed here is a quick list of what I think are the challenges for the new president in Syria. I won't go through them all. You can read them there quickly. Rebuild security, keep the minorities on side, work with Turkey to prevent a new mini Iraq on the northeast, neutralise the separatists in the Horan, hasten the removal of sanctions, and of course, rebuild the economy. So that's the formidable task, and you can set that against, in my book, against Mandela, where he had a reasonably viable economy going for him when he started his reform program. It's a superhuman role. So I just want to raise here, first of all, I always curl up in pain when I hear the description civil war. This was not civil war. It was an internal conflict which resulted from rebellion against the Assad government. But every point, this cauldron of trouble was refueled by outsiders, and still might be, by the way. After the tragic outcome of the attempts to help unseat the Assad family by Turkey, the Gulf states, and the Saudis, Russia, Iran, and let's not forget the United States, EU, and France, Ahmed al-Sharaa has emerged from the shadows of Idlib province, which is a fairly small province in northwestern Syria, which have been used by in a series of agreements between the Russians and the Syrian Assad government to send fighters from rebel activities in Aleppo and Homs in particular under an agreement to take themselves to the Idlib province and to give up their struggle. So it wasn't an easy environment when he became the leader of the Salvation Government, as he called it, in Idlib province. But he had ideas to break the deadlock, and none of this really emerged in the Western world, who was still very suspicious of the fact that Ahmed al-Sharaa had himself had a background in Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But he was, in his time in Idlib province, he was showing a lot of inclination to drop all the ideas that might be associated with Islamic State and to take a more moderate Islamist approach. In a brilliantly planned and executed campaign in the early days of December, he unseated Iraq in a process that I think nobody could have predicted, certainly not me, and has since offered a thought-through program to install a transitional government. But what I want to briefly look at here is can we assume that al-Sharaa has discarded much of his Islamist background and found a persona that fits with the present task? One thing that doesn't emerge in some of the media coverage is that a lot of his background can be explained in a middle-class Nasserite family in 1950s, 1960s Syria. His father his father had a first cousin, Farouk al-Sharaa, who happened to have been foreign minister in my time in Damascus and was always regarded as being one of the more moderate figures in the regime. We see here him making the small pilgrimage to Mecca in the lower picture with his wife Latifa, who herself was born not in the Golan, which is the origin of the Sharaa family, but in Qaryatain, which is sort of a fairly bedraggled town between Damascus and Homs. But the young Ahmed wasn't crushed by his experience, which I've outlined in the panel on the left, in Iraq, and under imprisonment by the Americans. When he emerged in December, he quickly shed the fatigues of a rebel for the business suits of the Syrian middle class. Now, this map shows the breakup of Syria as it was in December, at the end of when the conflict was dying down. The different types of shading and markings show the different factions which had control of the country. As you can see, there's a very large area which has horizontal banding that was more or less under the Assad government. But this is how this carve-up of Syria looks today. Underneath that, quite a lot has changed. So what are the chances of al-Sharaa implementing a reunified, gender, faith and ethnically neutral state when armbands dominate still the coloured patches, as you can see on this map of Syria? His government has given itself a 4-year transition period, but faces a new world, of course, where the post-World War II framework, we'd all once assumed was going to continue forever, is being dismantled by Trump. Now, I want to look here at the 4 challenges which I think have become obvious so far in the path taken by the government. And it ignores, of course, all the other challenges he has to face: rebuilding the economy, attracting back enough Syrians to help rebuild, restoring the educational system, and attracting outside support. So al-Sharaa faces a formidable challenge, but the framework he has outlined so far shows a good dose of realism and systematic thinking, a realisation that he has to carry all of Syria's communities with him and can't afford to pick fights he can't win. Let's summarise those 4 challenges. Both the Turks and the Americans have forces still in northeast Syria and across the northern frontier. Turkey had sought to prevent a new threat from secessionist Kurdish elements in the southeast. The US installed itself in that area as part of the residue of the campaign against Islamic State. It seemed convenient to get the Kurdish forces opposed to Assad to take on the role of guarding the camp of IS followers who had been taken in the American and Allied campaign. But since the time when the campaign has died down, few countries have agreed to repatriate the rebels who were in the encampments. Many of whom, of course, are not Syrian at all, but are brought in from other countries. In Trump's first attempt to withdraw forces in his first period as president, resulted in a mission creep which brought the total of Americans on the ground from 900 to 2,000. A fact that's only just been admitted by the Defense Department in Washington in December. Not everything that Trump says, of course, and less often does, is worth serious consideration. But 2 weeks after the fall of Damascus, he said, "The US should have nothing to do with Syria. This is not our fight." Now just remember that when the following months unfurl. So the next threat, the next challenge is southern Syria, including the Golan, stretching across to the Druze territory, right to the east on the map, east of my lower map. Now Netanyahu had nothing better to do one day in December than set up a series of media events showing him on the summit of Mount Hermon, gazing down towards Damascus and instructing a contingent of Israeli troops to address the risks presented by a possible build-up of abandoned rebel arms in Syria at his feet. One problem with the scenario, of course, was that it wasn't actually on the peak of Mount Hermon. development. He was on a lower peak of a long mountain range, not the summit, which lies at the northern end, closest to Damascus. So scary scenarios were painted of how close Israeli forces were now to Damascus. And that Bibi was on the case. Or was he? First, as I said, he wasn't on the summit at all. The summit is marked by a very distinctive white dome, which protects the communication facilities of the UN force, set up in the 1970s in an agreement painstakingly negotiated between the Israelis and the Syrians with American help. And that agreement has largely prevailed over the next 50 years. So why is he going on about the unstable situation in southern Syria? In fact, this has been the quietest of Israel's frontiers, with the Canny Druze population in Syria helping to soften any risk of confrontation. The accompanying Israeli party, though, took the occasion to check out whether the level of risk to Israel on the Syrian side of the zone had risen following the withdrawal of Syrian forces and the assumed arrival of Islamist, i.e. terrorist forces. For Netanyahu, it was a good story to distract the Israeli public from troubles back home. The Israelis, however, have now taken the opportunity to establish a logistics base just on the edge of the A and B lines which define the UN zone, claiming, of course, that their presence is temporary. Second of all, the media never mentioned that the zone had long been supervised by UN forces, hence their communication dome, and that both the Israeli and Syrian side had undertaken commitments dating back 52 years. I think I'm stepping on something, but
We're going to have to do CPR.
Something else.
there's something else. Okay. Oh, that's, I don't want to be electrocuted. That's no, I don't want to well, don't worry. Okay, thanks, Roger. It's significant that al-Shara didn't fall for the bait of Israel's defiance of this 1974 disengagement, and made it clear that he had better things on his mind. He quietly made it known that he would look to the Americans to assure the Israelis that the threat level had not risen. So that's the southern front. Now, the third front is the enclave in the coastal mountains, which is largely populated by Ismailis, sorry, not Ismailis, Alawis, who had once been the mainstay of the presence in the Syrian army under the Assads over 50 years. The Alawi enclave has been built up over the 50 years for the Assad family. It centres on the place indicated by the blue arrow here, Al-Qadaha, as well as on the coast Jeble and the interesting Russian base marked in red at Amimim on the coast. Was it also designated as a last refuge for the Alawite resistance? But al-Shara has issued rather lukewarm call for the Alawis to be accepted into the new Syria, given the appalling record they have in treating the population under the Assad family. But feeling in the Alawi heartland around the family seat of Al-Qadaha is clearly different, and many feared they would be punished for the savagery of the Assad regime. What touched off the short-lived uprising along the coast 2 weeks ago was probably disaffected Assadists, not so far accepted into the new army, perhaps aided by remaining foreign fighters, including Chechens and Uyghurs. The BBC attributed to the events which unfolded to a deadly ambush on a security patrol by gunmen loyal to the former regime. So two versions of this story have emerged. First is that it was masterminded out of the Russian base by renegade elements gathering around a former Assad officer, Giyaf Dallah, who was a commander with the old Syrian army's 4th Brigade, which is the most notoriously violent and brutal of the brigades of the army, led by Maher al-Assad, the youngest of the Assad brothers, who, by the way, has never been traced since the end of the conflict in December. He was notorious for the reign of terror he supervised during the whole conflict. The second interpretation is that Shara himself failed to rein in his own jihadist followers, who were anxious to take revenge on the Alawis. On either scenario, however, hundreds of Assad loyalists and families were summarily executed. Others took refuge in the Russian base at Hamamim. But what we certainly can say is that a loss of control under the new regime had set in. But was it intentional or not? The coastal area has since been quiet, but an inherently unstable situation will prevail until the unified government can form a reunified army to restore order and avoid contributing to the chaos themselves. This factor was emphasised by my old colleague in the Damascus embassy in 1985 the other day in the Lowy interpreter, Philip Ellison, and I've left the quote up there on the screen. I mean, essentially, the nub of it is his main path is to outrun these groups by the use of real inclusion of all Syrians in the steps to a safe and secure future. So in closing, two thoughts from Monuments of Syria are applied to the present situation. First, I plead to avoid playing Lenin's useful idiots. There are a lot of who've climbed onto various factions in this very complicated Syrian scene. It's of course a phrase defined as a person who thinks they are fighting for a cause without fully comprehending the consequences of their action. It is natural, of course, that throughout the conflict so much sympathy was generated by the humanitarian dimensions of a conflict. But sympathy for the plight of many Syrians can be manipulated by interest groups which themselves contribute to the tragedy. So these are my concluding thoughts, also taken from the last section of the book, and which reflects back to, well, as I'll explain in a minute, reflects back to the situation in 1920. Al-Shara has emphasised that Syrians must own this process, having at least got rid of the Russians and the Iranians and many others. When outside powers stepped in 100 years ago, they certainly helped set up the region to fail. For me, it's tempting but foolish to compare the present transitional period with the one in 1994 after Nelson Mandela's election victory in South Africa. But you see the same dot points appearing in the presentations. We have little choice but to let Al-Shara get on with the job he says he's doing, albeit with extremely limited means, as the clock is ticking furiously. So time is very rushed. Security was a marginal issue in South Africa, where I was there at the time in the mid-1990s. But as events in March 2025 on Syrian coastal centres show, dissent can break out in numerous guises across the country. Firm and fair governance is what is needed, but when in the last 100 years did Syria enjoy that? The same boxes are being ticked now as were being addressed at the time. National unity, constitutional rule, all faiths being able to practice as without restriction, rebuilding institutions, opening up the economy and ending kleptocracy. The difference in Syria now is that after 3 decades in hiding or in prison, whereas South Africa knew who Mandela was and the aims of the ANC he headed we don't have that luxury with any great confidence in trying to analyse al-Sharaa. Maybe he is the answer to Syria's prayers that the country has looked for since 1920. In any event, outsiders have to leave him to get on with the job and not help reheat the civil war. So in inverted commas. Okay, that's all I have to say, but happy to take questions.
That destroyed some of my superficial illusions, Ross. Thank you very much. Two questions quickly. What do you think Trump wants to do? Is he going to stay out of it altogether? The second is, does Netanyahu have any plans for territorial expansion into Syria or not?
What was the first part of the question? Sorry. Trump, yeah. Who can predict what Trump is? Trump will do whatever Netanyahu wants him to do. So that could be anything. It could very well be to just urge the Israelis to go hell for leather to wipe out whatever they want to get rid of in Syria. I don't think we can. And the second half, I forgot to.
Israel. Territorial expansion.
Well, they'll do what Trump wants them to do. They're sort of operating as sort of Siamese twins, really.
But you put a lot of faith, or some faith, in al-Sharaa being sensible, being moderate, wanting to get the place going. That's very interesting to hear. Thank you very much.
But Netanyahu wants to tear that down.
Why not?
And the interesting way he might go, I didn't bring this up in relation to southern Syria, is that they have always been trying to work the Druze. Because the Druze overlap on the Golan frontier, and they spread all the way across the Soweto. They're the main ethnic component of the provinces there. And the Syrians, the Israelis always wanted to know what the Druze are up to, but the Druze have been a bit too clever to let themselves be used. But I don't know what will happen this time.
Next question.
Thanks very much for your talk, Ross. What's been going on with Hezbollah and a mini war between Hezbollah and Syria in the last week or two? There's been fighting on the Lebanese border between Hezbollah and Syria.
And Syria?
Yeah.
Sorry, I lost that. I didn't pick that up.
Anyone else want to comment on this?
They're divided by non-Kurdish, by the way. That's a pretty formidable barrier between Hezbollah and southern Lebanon and the Syrians.
I've just seen it read in the paper.
Must be true.
I was wondering if the treatment of women might be a litmus test as to how the new government was going with regard to opening up to secular behaviour.
Well, virtually every article on Syria since December tries to open up that thought. Al-Sharaa has constantly said that he's been very cautious in what he says he wants to do in relation to women. He's not said much beyond that they won't face restrictions on dress codes.
Education?
Well, there's never been any educational barriers in Syria for women. So I think the question doesn't sort of arise in most people's minds.
Okay. We've got time for a couple more, please.
What's Putin up to in all that?
Sorry, say again.
Putin, Russia, any influence, any place
It's
going
too
on
busy
there?
in Ukraine.
Yes, I realise that, but do you think there's anything happening from that side?
Look, you could think of all sorts of fantastic interpretations. Was Putin behind the operation out of the Khmeimim based on the Syrian coast when the clash started between the rebel elements and the federal government? We just don't know. In fact, I'm surprised that there are still Russians there, but apparently there are, because I think that the Syrians have not said to them, "We want you all out," but the Russians have thought it might have been wise to take out a lot of their heavy equipment. So some of those big aeroplanes have been in to take away a lot of the heavy stuff. But I don't. Al-Sharaa has not ruled out the possibility of doing a new agreement to allow them to stay on in some form. There are two bases: the one at Khmeimim and a part of the port in Tartus.
What has their role been across the Russians? I hardly know anything about it.
Oh, they were very firmly in support of al-Assad's forces. They had their own forces on the ground, fighting to sort of stiffen the role of the Syrian forces. And their force was very heavily bombing a lot of the civilian centres in northern and central Syria. So they've been right in on the fight.
Next question.
Christians overall.
Wait for the mic.
Sorry. Thank you. Has there been a movement of Christians back to Syria since the change, or out, or no discernible difference?
I think there has been some movement. I mean, the reaction of Christians is fairly guarded, but not too critical. They do raise the position of women and any restrictions that might be placed on non-Muslims, but some of the bishops have been quite firmly in support of al-Sharaa, depending on the faith. I mean, the Armenians are fairly pro, for example. So it's a mixed bag, but the Christians will do whatever assists their survival. And I think they got a lot of support from the Assad in the Assad period, which they would never admit to because it wasn't a good look in the West. But they were given a lot of privileges which they hadn't necessarily enjoyed in earlier decades. So I think they'll be very cautious about what deal they now get out of the al-Assad government. Sorry, the al-Sharaa government.
We have time for one final question.
What of the northeast? Turkey, Iraq, the US, Kurds. Is there any way just understand what might happen there?
Well, there has in fact been an agreement signed between al-Sharaa government and the Turks on this. It's quite a remarkable breakthrough. It happened last week. I don't know exactly what the terms are, but it's, I think, something which has been a very sudden bright spot on the horizon. Because I think nobody really wants to see that situation just dragging on and on and on and on, particularly given the number of people who are held up in camps who can't be helped unless there's a better climate for their future. But I don't know exactly what the terms are, but over the decades there have been countless attempts to settle the role of Kurds within the Syrian unified structure. Some more successful than others. So it's not out of his world to imagine that something would come out of the deal which was struck last week.